Petro. And on behalf of the ACHQC, welcome to Core Insights. This is our monthly meeting. Tonight we have four very interesting topics. And so the way we're going to run this tonight is we're going to do 12-minute talks. And then after each talk, we're going to try to get through at least one question from each of our moderators. And then after that, if you guys feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll either get to those questions as we go, or if we're running behind, the speaker can always answer them in the chat room. And then, if there's time at the end, we can go through some of the high yield points in the chat box. So I encourage you to use the chat box so that we can reference it later as well. All right, so our first speaker is Savannah Renshaw from The Ohio State University. And she's going to tell us if we can develop a patient-reported outcome to identify long-term catastrophic mesh complications. All right, Savannah, and then everyone else, go ahead and give yourself a mute.
All right, let me pull this up. I appreciate you putting the on there. Some people leave that off. All right, can you guys see that okay? Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Savannah Renshaw, and I work as a public health researcher at Ohio State here in our Department of Surgery. And tonight I'm going to share a project that we've been working on that aims to answer this question: can we develop a patient-reported outcome to identify long-term catastrophic mesh-related complications? So as you all know, mesh products are being increasingly utilized in all types of hernia repair, with an overwhelming number of products on the market. And as this has increased, so has the heterogeneity of the patient population that receives mesh, as well as the overall volume of patients that are requiring long-term follow-up. But despite this growing need, clinicians have essentially no way right now to assess for long-term mesh-related events until, that is, a patient presents back in front of them. So we have virtually no way of even estimating the incidence of these events, which are both costly to our healthcare systems and simultaneously devastating for patients. So this is especially important in terms of catastrophic events like mesh failure, infection, and ultimately excision. The ability then to better understand the rate at which these complications occur is crucial to fostering informed discussions and shared decision-making between surgeons and patients. So therefore, we wanted to see if there's a way that we can leverage patient-reported outcomes to create a tool that specifically screens for this type of event and eventually help inform us about when, where, and in whom these events occur. The first step in this process was information gathering and theme generation, which we performed through qualitative interviews with all the stakeholders in this area. So this included patients who had specifically experienced some of our mesh-related events, as well as abdominal core surgeons who operate on these cases, industry leaders who help develop these products, and finally with our colleagues at the US FDA as experts in the future regulatory implications for this tool. After conducting almost 36 interviews, we transcribed the interviews and began the thematic analysis. We partnered with a PhD-trained psychometrician with a history working not just in surgery, but specifically in hernia patients to identify key domains. After reviewing the content, we were able to identify 5 key areas. These were all central themes that were prevalent among the stakeholders and indicate to us on the other side as researchers that these are the areas which we would be most important to design our tool around. So these domains ultimately included common indicators of mesh-related complications, which is essentially clarifying what our outcome of interest looks like, knowledge of potential complications, which speaks to the patient experience preoperatively, relationship or satisfaction with the provider, as many of these events become chronic conditions that we interestingly found were often mitigated or worsened by the patient's connection to the surgical team. Fourth, we had psychosocial impact, which I personally find to be the most interesting, as it's likely the furthest reaching domain and one that may be more easily overlooked in existing PROs or other tools. And finally, overall function, which includes the patient's return to activity, as well as their overall perception of how well basically their repair has impacted their function in the long term. So as the person who completed these interviews, I found the patient experience to be the most impactful. And so to give you all a glimpse of how these went, I wanted to include some of the quotes that were later coded into each of these domains to kind of help illustrate not only how the process works, but also how desperate these patients really are to understand this area. So the first is this domain indicators of complication. A patient reported, I started to notice a white spot on my belly and found out it was actually a piece of mesh coming out. So I think that this kind of demonstrates potentially a gap in health literacy or the way that these risks are communicated to patients. Secondly, we have this knowledge of potential complications. This patient stated, I know any surgery has risks, but I had no specific knowledge about mesh. Again, this speaks to the hesitancy on the patient's part and how that specific knowledge may have changed their perception of the later mesh event. Next, we have the relationship with providers. In this case, the patient said he doesn't care that this has been a 5-year process for me. And while that may not necessarily be the case, I think this speaks to the point in the last slide about how this becomes a chronic process and really just drives home how crucial that is for patients. Next, we have the psychosocial impact, which this quote really got me, where this patient told me that taking care of everything and continuing life during all of this, even just taking care of my dogs, has started to stress me out. And so I think that this is a great indicator of how far this can reach into patients' lives and really just gives perspective. So this domain is important for kind of capturing all of that. And then lastly, we have the overall function for kind of everything else we don't get in the earlier domains. And this patient had stated, because of my inability to be active and do anything else, it makes it hard to manage anything else with my health, which if you think about it from a life course perspective, this is actually really critical to understand that if all of our patients or many of our patients are reporting this in their interviews after these mesh events, it really underscores the importance of understanding how these fit into their overall health in the long term. So with that, we use these domains to develop individual items to make up a new patient-reported outcome tool. The CompQ is the Complications of Mesh Placement Questionnaire, which will be sensitive to identifying patients who may be at risk of mesh-related complications. We went through an iterative process coming up with items and received extensive feedback and revisions from our stakeholders at every step of the way. And then finally, we went to the FDA to obtain feedback specific to how the PRO would function in a regulatory capacity. Several versions later, we are excited to report that we have finally arrived at a PRO that contains only 5 questions and takes patients about a minute to complete. So when we reached a complete instrument, we actually took the working version back to the original patient stakeholders, and we completed what I think were probably the most important stakeholder interviews. And this was to pilot test each item just as a preliminary step to ensure understanding, context, and most importantly, that the original intent of their responses was maintained. I thought that getting that integrity as the interviewer, translating this into a tool, was really, really central to what we were doing. So it was important to go back to them. And as you can see from these quotes here, I think it's important to note that the patients did feel like their experiences were reflected. And when I say their experiences are reflected, I mean that for the purpose of the tool, they indicated that if they had received this questionnaire after having one of their mesh-related events, that they would have answered in the affirmative, which tells us in an early stage of design that this questionnaire could work the way it's designed to. So one patient said, that you guys have covered everything. It's like you took the words right out of my mouth. And then the next patient said, if patients want to take a risk and understand what they're getting into, maybe this will help surgeons decide to operate. It doesn't seem like anyone cares about my quality of life because it doesn't line up with a regular post-op outcome. And I think that that really resonates in this area because these are quality of life issues. And one of the questions that we seek to answer through this is how those are impacted in the long term. So this is the actual CompQ itself. Each item will be answered on a Likert scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and we'll then calculate a composite score that will be able to help identify patients at risk of these mesh complications for more specific follow-up. So this first question addresses the patient complications, just an affirmative, yes, I experienced one of these complications requiring an additional surgery. The following, I understood the risks and complications associated with repair. Next, I'm satisfied with the support I received from my team. Fourth, it's interesting to me, this was recommended by our FDA colleagues to frame it this way and ask, given the chance I would do this again. And then lastly, I am scared of damaging my hernia repair site. we found in our testing that this really kind of encapsulates the nature of that fear afterwards and return to function and quality of life. So these are the 5 items we landed on, and we are about to deploy our next step. So the next phase of development involves deploying this to a new pool of patients who haven't seen it before, and using item response theory to ensure the items are accurate and reliable, and basically testing what we want them to test. So we're excited to carry this project into the future, as we personally see a lot of important implications in this space. Improving post-market device surveillance from a regulatory and industry perspective helps us to ensure quality and care, which we're all invested in. But it also helps us to answer important questions related to long-term follow-up for these cases, which we know is an area of concern for this disease process. But finally, understanding distribution and prevalence as a public health person, understanding the distribution and prevalence of these events is also important to population health, especially as we know that hernias continue to rise in incidence and treatment in the United States. This will be a growing area of interest and a question that quite honestly needs to be answered. So with that, we're really, really grateful to all of our partners who have participated in this work. It's been a long process, and we're hopeful about the directions we can take this. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions you guys have, or I think maybe one question. I know I was a little short, but I tried to cut some out so to leave time for everything else. So thank you.
Savannah, that was spectacular. I think what a lot of folks don't really appreciate is how we get a lot of the tools that we use, whether it's Hercules or the SF-36 or the Promise Score. A lot of people don't understand how you do the really hard work up front, interviewing patients in order to get to the point where you can have a survey. I think that is such an important step, and you've done the hardest part, and now the fun part is to validate it. If you don't mind, can you actually go back to your five questions? Can you pull it up again?
1 second.
And because my question was, so how is this designed so that if you answer yes or no to any one of those, it's considered a positive, or is there a scoring system, or how will the result come out?
Right, so the idea is to use a scoring system. However, that's one of the things that we aren't sure of just yet. It kind of depends how each item pilot tests, because we're not sure that these are the final questions that'll be included. However, say a patient answers yes to the first question, or strongly agree that I did experience a complication that required additional surgery.
Oh, so these are Likert scales.
Yeah. And they answer, I'm scared of damaging my repair site, and I did not understand the risk. The way each of these are scored, it would give them a high score, which would flag us as reviewers to say this patient would be screened in as a potential person who has experienced one of these mesh-related events and may be in need of additional follow-up. So that's kind of how we envision this working. The actual scoring, it's kind of hard, and our psychometrician could probably speak to this better. But on the front end, we have this idea that we would basically kind of like Hercules, a high score to be good and a low score to be bad, or vice versa. But one of the things we did encounter with the patients and with our industry partners was the directionality of some of these statements. We tried to keep them all the same way, but we didn't want to get into double negatives and confusion in that area. So given the feedback we got there, we kind of had to keep some of these the way they are. So it'll be interesting to see how they score, and what kind of questions trip people up and what it ultimately ends up looking like. But I think, to your point, ultimately having the dream would be to have a threshold where if a patient scores over this, we screen them in. If they score below that, we consider them, in the clear.
Excellent. Bryan and Art are our other 2 moderators. You guys, we have time for probably a question each.
Yeah, just looking at the sequence of questions, Savannah, I was just thinking if the 5th question, which goes back to fear and whether it's good to have that 3rd or 4th, 5th question. I mean, the 4th question seemed to be about regret, decision regret sort of thing. And it's good to keep it last. Just a thought. What do you think about that?
I think that's a good point. I think it actually might read better in that way as well.
Savannah, this is Bryan. On the first question, it says that they had a further procedure. I see a lot of patients that they won't go back to surgery because of fear or other reasons. Does that capture those that don't have an additional procedure or a different additional, did I miss that part of it?
So one of the things that was hard for us was the question one actually used to have a long list of things that we wanted to include. But what we found was when we went back to the patients, it was really hard for them to discern which exactly had happened. What we landed on eventually was that most patients remember interventions. They do remember operations, but because some people will have fear of going back to surgery, we tried to include this first bit that does say, I experienced a complication such as something like severe pain. So that would indicate to us that a patient does have severe pain, which may indicate a mesh-related event has occurred, but they may not have necessarily had an operative intervention just yet.
Okay, thanks.
And that way they should still likely score on a strongly agree, but without having to have necessitated that surgery.
This is awesome. I think this is going to be a big deal, and I think it's going to be used a lot in the future. So it's a great job putting this together, and good luck trying to validate it. And we look forward to seeing more. So I'm going to try to keep us on time. So we're going to scoot ahead to the next talk. If anyone has questions about this talk, feel free to keep putting things in the chat room. And if we have time at the end, we'll circle back to some of those questions.
So Molly Olson will be presenting next. She's at Weill Cornell Medicine, senior analyst, senior statistician, who works on ACHQC registry and also hernia or abdominal core health coordinated registry network. Molly.
Yeah, thanks, Art. So like Art said, I'm at Weill Cornell. I'm a biostatistician for the ACHQC, for those of you who don't know me. And then I'm also, like Art said, a senior analyst at MD EpiNet. And I'm going to talk today about how we can combine ACHQC data with administrative data to increase our long-term follow-up. Let's see here. So before I start, I just wanted to give a brief introduction of MD EpiNet for those of you who weren't familiar. MD EpiNet is a global public-private partnership that brings together resources to advance a medical device evaluation and surveillance system. They bring together leadership, expertise, and resources from healthcare industry, patient groups, payers, academia, and government. MD EpiNet is a leader in the development of novel and innovative approaches for robust evidence generation and the creation of real-world data resources that support device evaluation. And they aim to develop methodologies to support real-world evidence and to conduct research studies to better understand medical device performance utilizing coordinated registry networks. And so the ACHQC actually partnered with MD EpiNet to establish the Abdominal Core Health Coordinated Registry Network, or shortened for CRN. And the CRN is just an organized system that leverages a variety of resources to address key questions related to clinical research questions and long-term surveillance of techniques and devices that are a critical aspect to abdominal core health. And when the Abdominal Core Health CRN was initiated, it identified two primary objectives. The first of which was to establish a CRN capable of addressing clinical questions and enabling post-market surveillance, and the second being to harmonize the collection of abdominal core health data. And for the sake of tonight's talk, I'm just focusing on the first objective, which is to establish the CRN capable of addressing clinical questions and enabling post-market surveillance. And one of the critical factors in achieving this objective is to successfully obtain long-term follow-up so that we can effectively evaluate long-term complications and performance of devices and techniques. So a neat tool to supplement and extend the follow-up of the ACHQC registry is something that we call data linkages. Before going into the nuts and bolts, I first wanted to look at different data sources. So registry data and claims or administrative data actually have they're actually very complementary of each other, and they have very complementary strengths in particular. So some of the advantages of registry data are that it has complete and accurate clinical information, it has detailed device information, and a high rate of short-term follow-up completion. Some of the disadvantages, however, are that they have limited long-term follow-up. And some of the reasons why they have limited long-term follow-up is because it's limited to same physician. So for example, if a patient had a surgery with physician A, but had routine care with physician B, we probably wouldn't capture all the data with physician B. And then it's also limited to physician and patient participation within the registry. However, claims and administrative data can address the shortcomings of registries, namely by having the data is routinely available in claims and administrative data. It captures most physician-patient contact. It captures patient visits across facilities and care providers. It has complete long-term follow-up and a large sample size. However, a primary limitation of the claims and administrative data is that the submitted data lacks critical details about procedures and devices, and that's important because those two aspects can have a major influence on outcomes. We can take advantage of the strengths of both of these data sources, however, by combining the data by performing what's called a data linkage. So there's two ways to do this. The first would be a direct linkage where you take two data sources and create a single data repository by linking the patients together using direct patient identifiers, such as a patient's name, social security number, medical record number, address, etc. The second way would be to do an indirect linkage, which would be linking the two data sources by indirect identifiers, such as date of birth, sex, procedure date, facility ID, zip code, etc. As you might imagine, direct linkage is more difficult to perform because we would probably need to go through a third-party contractor, or more agreements need to be in place. There's patient privacy concerns. It's expensive. The list goes on, and it would just take a long time, and it would be a huge headache. However, lucky for us, one of our faculty at Cornell and MD EpiNet created and validated an indirect sequential matching algorithm. She used the American Joint Replacement Registry and New York State claims data, which we call SPARCS, to validate this linkage algorithm. So this algorithm takes two data sources, specifically a registry and an administrative data source, and sequentially matches patients from both of these data sources through their indirect patient identifiers. And you can kind of see those identifiers listed here. They were facility ID, year and month of birth, sex, date of procedure, and zip code. And the algorithm actually accounts for missing and inaccurate identifiers. For example, if a patient in the registry had a zip code that was 1 digit off from the zip code that was in the administrative data, or the procedure date was off by a day, this algorithm can actually catch that. And then the final matching sequence that was used in the algorithm was that of which that maximized the linkage capacity. And so they compared the results of the indirect matching to those of direct matching. So then they also did a direct matching where they used direct identifiers such as the medical record number or social security number or something. So they compared those two results, and they found that the sensitivity for the indirect matching algorithm was as high as 92%, and the accuracy was greater than 99.9%. And even when one of the indirect identifiers was unavailable, it achieved 90% sensitivity and 99.8% accuracy. So the availability of this indirect linkage algorithm makes linking the ACHQC registry and administrative data sources accessible, reliable, and very feasible, and thereby supplementing the registry data and increasing its long-term follow-up. And then under the umbrella of the Abdominal Core Health CRN, we are underway with the ACHQC registry and SPARCS, or like the New York State claims data linkage, using this indirect method. Currently, we're just focusing on the ventral module for now, and then in the future, we'll be moving to inguinal. And then we also have planned linkages for the ACHQC registry with Medicare and California State as well. So great, now we have longer follow-up, let's start analyzing. We'll wait. Remember how one of the data disadvantages I had mentioned earlier was that administrative data lacks clinical clarity. So since administrative data will provide a bulk or a good portion of the long-term follow-up for registry patients, it's important that we are able to extract clinical information about outcomes from it. Administrative data comes in the form of billing codes such as ICD-9, ICD-10, CPT, and the clinical accuracy of these billing codes has not been previously assessed in the abdominal core health space yet. So another effort the Abdominal Core Health CRN is spearheading is the development and validation of an administrative coding algorithm that targets long-term catastrophic mesh-related complications. So this coding algorithm will use the billing codes to identify reoperations for recurrence, major complications requiring emergency surgery, and non-recurrence procedural interventions in the administrative data. And then we will take the results of that administrative coding algorithm and validate it against chart reviews that we use as the gold standard. And so then we'll use that comparison to evaluate the accuracy of the algorithm. So the initial algorithm has been developed, and we're progressing with the data collection for the algorithm validation portion currently. So that's kind of our progress. And with that, we're excited to continue making progress with these studies and advancing the registry and CRN.
Thank you, Molly. And in a preliminary study that you did, you already did some linkage, right?
Mm-hmm.
A registry with claims. Can you talk about how promising this is, and also maybe a little bit about any logistics challenges that you experienced and our team experienced in general, bringing this whole data together?
Yeah,
because it sounds sometimes really easy. Just bring two data, link it. It sounds like a technical challenge, but I just wanted you to comment about organizational data use agreements and all the complexities involved with working with various data sets like this.
Mm-hmm. So we, like Art said, we did do a brief pilot study already between Sparks, the New York State Claims Data, and the ACHQC registry. At the time that we did it, we only had access to New York data prior to 2017 or 2017 and prior. And as we all know, I think it was 2017, the QC registry hadn't been around that long. And so we only had a few years overlap that we could link. And then they also had to be New York State residents. And so I think the sample size we had for ventral patients was like 131, if I remember correctly. But we successfully were able to link, I think it was like 90% of those patients, of 131 patients in that pilot study. So we're able to successfully link 100 or 90% of 130 patients in the registry to New York State claims data. But as far as logistical challenges, yes, it sounds like a technical problem, but actually we're still in the midst of trying to get the DUA and everything sorted out, because even though these are indirect identifiers, the QC is very protective of patient privacy. And so we are trying to be able to differentiate between ventral and inguinal patients, and that's taken a couple extra steps. And then we also need a way, so once we link New York State and the registry data, we need a way to link it back to the registry data. So we need access to like the patient IDs and stuff like that. So it is a work in progress. So that's kind of really my comments on it.
Thank you.
Molly, that's awesome. I think you've done the first hard part, which is trying to link the two databases. The next thing that is trying to figure out what's in the chart and how to put that into ones and zeros. I think because sometimes 3 surgeons in a room looking at a CT scan can't decide whether there's a recurrence or not. And so I think that's the hard part. And I'm thinking, is this going to look something like a dot phrase? So is that the easiest way for you guys to be able to extract it on the back end? Because short of that, it's hard looking at a chart and trying to figure out and actually extract meaningful data. I think often the mistake is to think that the data it's in there somewhere. We just have to figure out how to get it out. And a lot of times that's just not true. There's just not the true accurate data, or at least not in a way that you can extract reliably every single time.
Sorry, was there a question in there? I think I missed it.
Oh, well, no. Are you thinking of is this going to look something like a dot phrase in order for you to be able to reliably extract the data from the EMR?
I don't think I know what a dot phrase is.
Maybe because I think you're kind of talking about 2 separate things. So what Molly's saying, Clayton, is they're linking administrative level data. So you have to be careful of the question that they're asking the administrative data. So they won't ask for hernia recurrence. They'll ask for reoperation for recurrence, which would be a common European measure of hernia recurrence. Or they'll look for reoperation with another hernia diagnosis. So they're not actually looking at the chart. They're looking at administrative data and trying to link the good part of administrative data and coding with the clinical rich data of the QC. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I see.
Is that Molly? Am I stating that correctly? Just so I don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm thinking of it the other way around.
No, they're not going to go look in charts. They're going to look at the administrative data set and link that to all that we know what happened through the QC.
I see. Okay, I'm thinking of it backwards. I'm thinking of supplementing the QC, whereas we're supplementing some of the administrative data.
Right.
I see. Okay.
Well, it's a hybrid. These databases mutually strengthen each other. Clayton, back to you.
Sure. Yeah. So again, just to stay on time, we're going to move on to our third talk from Dennis McMahon. He's the Senior Director of Medical Affairs, and he's going to talk to us about a medical device company's perspective on post-marketing surveillance and the impact to surgeons.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to present on our perspective on post-market surveillance and the impact to surgeons. Two of my colleagues, Donna from regulatory and Donna from clinical, who's also going to help me present. So first of all, how did we get here? There's been increasing regulations around the world, and a few years ago, there weren't that many regulations and focus on approval trials or even real world data. I think it's understandable that there were events that happened. One notable thing recently was the drug-eluting stent safety scare, where there's congressional hearings and a big focus on this real-world data where there's a safety signal only seen in real-world use in thousands of patients. So with several events like this, I think the FDA really focused from just on the approval of devices to their whole product life cycle. And also they're looking at their Sentinel initiative of active surveillance. So as a medical device company, the regulations have been going up and up in terms of what it takes to get things approved. And then to keep things on the market, they want more clinical data in the real world. And then each country is asking for more data. So luckily there's been several groups. Molly mentioned the MD EpiNet, and that's a public-private partnership, and the FDA is part of that. It's really looking at how can we have better use of our data? How can we do information sharing across countries, or leveraging registries or data sets that are already there so that we can make meaningful use of these data. In Europe, people are probably aware that they've really strengthened their requirements recently. They just the MDR went into effect in May 2021, and this was a big difference. And from MDD, what was in the past, to MDR, and this was mainly driven by the PIP implant scandal, where hundreds of thousands of women had these implants that were not with medical grade silicone, and then had many issues later on. The Japan PMDA, they have their own regulations and requests for data. There's the IMDRF for a lot of the other countries, and the China CFDA looking for more data.
Okay.
Now Donna's going to present on a regulatory front.
Can everybody hear me? Excellent, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Donna Mitchell-McGaldy. So manufacturers are required to conduct periodic evaluations of their devices utilizing all different sources of clinical data in order to ensure that their devices are safe and they perform as expected. Now, this is a global requirement. There are many economic communities and countries that are requiring us to do these evaluations. Some of them are the European Union under the MedDev and EUMDR. We've got TGA, Australia, and Brazil are just a couple of them that are requiring these periodic evaluations. The frequency of the evaluations depend on the risks associated with the device. So with our surgical mesh and fixation devices, they are the higher class 3, so we have to do these annually. There are a variety of different sources of clinical data that we have to collect and analyze in these clinical evaluation reports. The preclinical data from any internal testing that we've done for our verification, validation, biocompatibility, any type of comparable studies that we're doing, manufacturer-sponsored data, either published or unpublished clinical studies, non-manufacturer sponsored studies that we can get any results from clinicaltrials.gov or the WHO database. The EU also has a registry for clinical trials as well. Our post-market data, we have both our internal customer complaints, FDA mod. We take a look at TPLC, which is the total product life cycle in the FDA. We take a look at other sources of complaints and withdrawals and recalls too from other sources outside the US as well. We take a look and do a systematic literature analysis of all clinical studies that are out there. We also take a look at what we're seeing for other standards of care, state of the art, and compare the outcomes of our devices to those of other standards of care. And then, of course, now just recently, within I'd say the last 4 years, we've incorporated the real world registry data, which has really filled an unmet need as far as the clinical evaluation is concerned, because it's the first time we're actually able to collect real world use data on and really get a full picture of how our device is working out there in the real world. So you can click to the next one. So the clinical evaluations that we do are they have a multi-purpose. We collect the adverse events, and what we have to do is we have to take a look and see if there are any unknown risks or harms that we haven't had identified previously in our risk documentation. We also have to see if there are any known risks, and we're seeing, let's say, an increase in severity, or we're seeing an increase in a safety signal of a known risk. Labeling, we have to identify any off-label use and track to make sure that there are no concerns there. We also have to ensure that all clinical claims in our marketing brochures and collateral have the sufficient supporting evidence. For risks, we have to make sure that there's no change in the benefit risk profile as we go through and take a look at everything. And again, previously to what I just said, we need to assess that our device still performs consistently with what we're seeing in other standards of care. And then lastly, we need to identify any overall gaps in our clinical evidence, which will lead us to inform the PMCF and determine whether we need to do a post-market clinical follow-up or not. And so with that, I'll give it to Donna O.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks, Dennis.
Yep.
So yeah, so I think it's really important that we take a look at the product from a full life cycle perspective. So what Donna was just describing is kind of that clinical evaluation piece, which happens both pre-market, right before you launch your product, and then also happens in the post-market space. And what Dennis and I tried to help incorporate into that process is clinical data generation in that post-market space that can be either related to gaps that have been identified from the clinical evaluation, or it could be part of our process for proactive post-market surveillance. So you want to continue to take a look at your device long-term. So we've heard both from Savannah and Molly today about the challenges about long-term data collection. That's really important for us. We're really excited to hear that. And that is going to be really increasingly important as we look at the increased scrutiny from regulators. So we're looking forward to hearing more on that at a later time. So going on to the next slide, I'll show you a little bit here. There's two pieces. This is one example from Europe. If you can click one more time, Dennis, this will give an overall view of a few different reasons why you might actually need to do a clinical study or gather a bit additional data to help support your medical device when it's in post-market. Could be something that's really innovative and there's not a lot of data out there. So maybe a new indication or new application, or a slight change to the intended use, an expansion. Maybe you were only in the ventral space and now you're looking to get into hiatal. Potentially if there's a high-risk patient population, or again, as Donna mentioned, when there's unanswered clinical questions. These are all different reasons why we might need to do more data than we would normally look at. So these are a few examples. And that leads me to our next slide where we go into our data approach of how we like to gather data from different venues. There's a traditional, what we normally think of as our gold standard RCTs with clinical studies. They can be sponsored or investigator initiated, and they're both, produce very valuable data. There's the registry data that we gather from, registries such as ACHQC, and that helps a ton to help us look at the data short-term and long-term when it's available. And then real-world evidence, as we're seeing, is becoming more and more important to show that we are continually to look at our product over the life cycle. And these are just three different examples that help us support our product in the post-market phase.
Thanks, Donna. And it brings it back to what does this mean for the surgeon? So the real world data hopefully is what's driving surgeon decisions. This example of the physio mesh that was eventually rolled from the market, it came out because of publications from the Hernia Med and the Danish registries in real world use. We also look at the registry data to inform our product design changes and new products that we want to bring to the market. And last, the data, hopefully, if it's large enough and of adequate enough quality, it can be used for practice recommendations and for guidelines. So that's the end of our presentation.
That was really nice and informative as well. Here, Bryan, if you have a question, I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah, sorry. No, this is Bryan. Dennis, just a question for you guys. So how do you kind of tell with your post-market surveillance, how much of this is a mesh-related event and how much is where the mesh is the side effect, an infected seroma or something like that? Are there things that you can kind of tease out of the data that helps determine that?
Yeah, it's a good question. We spend a lot of time sifting through the data and saying, is this related to the procedure or the mesh or possibly related to the mesh? And we've come up with like a dictionary of events per disease or product that we categorize. It's likely related to the mesh. so that in the future, someone else, a different person, isn't judging it differently. And then from that, we err on the side that it could possibly be related to the mesh, so we have a more inclusive one. And then we look at rates from the literature and from years prior, so that we try to make sense out of those rates. So like if, for instance, you said seroma, we know what the average seroma rate is for an inguinal hernia repair that's open, and then a ventral hernia that's open. And so we want to compare against that.
How does the device kind of graduate from post-market surveillance to standard of care? Is it number of cases? Is it number of pieces implanted? Or is it like more of a how long it's been around and more of a time dependent thing?
Yeah, I think it's definitely both, that you need enough data of use in the acute period and then enough long-term data, because like the drug-eluting stents and then the physio mesh, it was only in longer-term follow-up that you saw these safety signals of concern.
Dennis, I think the requirements of what enough is still changing. So each year we're being asked for more and more data, which I think is in the benefit of the patients. It's in the benefit of our healthcare system, but it makes it really difficult to have that quantitative, objective criteria to understand what that means. So we're always looking for more to keep assessing and making sure we're doing the right thing.
So the FDA kind of manages just on a case-by-case basis then, essentially? Is there a mark? Is there like a defined finish line of, okay, we're done with post-market surveillance, or not really? Like, it's not really how it works.
No, I mean, we'll hear from Dr. Gibeily soon, but for our perspective, no, they look at it year to year, and they want us to be actively still pursuing it. So we're excited to hear about some of the data linkages that Molly talked about, and that it is expensive for companies to do these studies, but we're very thankful for a lot of these creative ways of doing it, because we think that good post-market follow-up is good business, because we think
Oh, I think he froze.
I think we lost him, but yeah, not to speak for him, but yeah, I think we're really excited because we need the long-term data to stay in business, but it's also the right thing to do. It's going to help us create better products. It's going to help the patients, and I think it's good for everyone all around.
Excellent. All right, very good. So I guess Art, we want to go on to the last one.
Clayton, are you asking me?
Oh, yep. Do you want to introduce the last speaker?
Sure, I can do that. So next speaker is George Gibeily. George is a medical officer at FDA and a leader in hernia space and surgical device evaluation space. And he is the primary reviewer for mesh products, I think. George? George, can you hear us? You might be on mute.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Just to say, I'm a medical officer in the Office of Infectious Disease and Reconstructive Devices. Can you all see my screen? My PowerPoint?
Yes,
yep.
I can see it.
You can see our PowerPoint. Good. So I'm here with Benita Asher, our director, and I want to, from the get-go, congratulate Savannah and Molly and Dennis on really great presentations. I'm going to touch on all of them and kind of give our FDA perspective on those different projects and perspectives. First of all, I lost my PowerPoint here. you know, challenge dogma. We all do this every single day. At FDA, we, like you, ask the hard scientific questions, look to patients to understand what they want, and work considering these things to make the best treatments available to them. Patients are at the heart of what we do. As a public health agency, and we strive to ensure device safety and innovation are not mutually exclusive by broadly considering medical device benefit versus risk. And this includes the patient perspective as well. Our goal is to give patients in the US access to high quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance. We like to say first in the world. So the Medical Device Amendment to the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act of 1976 gave FDA specific authority to regulate the safety and effectiveness of medical devices using valid scientific evidence to support regulatory decisions. Pre-1976 devices with a long history of safe and effective use could be used to support the pre-market notification of a new device with moderate risk, establishing the substantial equivalence of those devices through the 510(k) pathway. So if the post-1976 device had the same intended use and indications of use and was legally marketed with technology that was same or did not raise new questions of safety and effectiveness, then it could be cleared to go to market through the 510(k) pathway. Surgical mesh is considered a moderate risk or class 2 device. And so they're regulated through the 510(k) pathway, and most devices are cleared based on bench and animal testing, demonstrating comparable tensile strength, burst strength, suture pullout strength, elasticity, compliance, porosity, all of the above. These are all engineering evaluations and devices found to be substantially equivalent to the predicate through this pathway are at least as good as the predicate. But there's no guarantee that they're clinically better, just equivalent. The clinical data gathered through the QC is so important because surgeons may not change from the mesh used successfully for many years to a mesh which is simply substantially equivalent to that clinical data. And that includes myself. I've had many opportunities to engage industry in my career, and that is something that I always wish for. And so I think the QC has the potential to provide that. So in the last 8 years under Ben Polos's and Mike Rosen's leadership, the QC has grown to be a national registry representing all 50 states and 425 sites, 420 surgeons. I've memorized all of this, as you can see, and 80,000 or more both ventral and inguinal hernia patients, with provisions for long-term follow-up through PRO, and most recently through targeted long-term follow-up, because it's difficult to follow 80,000 more patients long-term. It's expensive, but if you target a specific patient population, you're more likely to be able to get that long-term follow-up. Patients of specific interest. The information provided by the QC is timely and actionable, we think, at the FDA, and in a very, I have there a reference to a very relevant article published in the Annals of Surgery by Jita Parabu of the QC, and reports on how surgeons participating in the QC registry recognize the problem with primary mesh failure in a certain mesh type based solely on QC data. The executive members of the QC directly informed industry field safety officers who initiated a device correction with specific hernia detailing. Within 9 months, the device correction occurred. It was amazing. And after only 27 adverse events, this decreased patient harm as well as healthcare costs, including cost to industry. And so,
George, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Yeah. Because you have 13 slides, but we're stuck at slide number 1.
Oh my goodness. Thanks for interrupting me. Let me see if can you see that? I apologize, folks.
No, we can't
we
see.
see your second screen, I think.
I think you have to go, to presentation mode I think you're in, if you end the slideshow up at the top there, you see on the very top of your screen, if you click the end slideshow, it's at the very top of your screen. There's like a show taskbar, display settings, and end slideshow. Or maybe if you right click.
It's kind of towards the middle.
I see share, stop
Yeah, I
share.
think it's, that thing is blocking you. If you go to view options and you come out of full screen, you exit full screen. I think the sharing thing is blocking your vision of that. We can see it, but you can't.
Okay, resume share here.
There you go. Now go. Yeah, you can do it from the beginning. That's fine. You're on a different view. That's the problem. Yeah, now you got it. Good. Yep, you got it. That's good now.
Good. Okay.
Good
Sorry
job.
about that.
Good save.
Okay. Okay. This is just, well, anyway, this is just one example of how where all stakeholders can work together to improve hernia treatment across the US and globally using QC data. In another instance, QC data was used to justify medical device marketing claims. Here, while robotic ventral hernia repair was being performed as practice of medicine, it was an off-label indication. The QC provided real-world evidence to industry with propensity match comparisons of key measures, comparing the Da Vinci Xi surgical system with laparoscopic and open ventral hernia procedures, demonstrating comparable 30-day findings. The company submitted this data to FDA, justifying hernia repair with the Da Vinci system, making this off-label indication on-label so that they can not only market the procedure, but maybe more importantly, also train users in best practice for robotic-assisted ventral hernia repair using the Da Vinci system. So the AHQC has provided valuable data and has really, in our opinion, elevated the standard of care of hernia repair patients across the US and globally. And so while I've cited only a couple examples, the real world evidence collected through the QC provides many opportunities for use in mesh device regulatory decisions. The real world data sources can include diagnostic labs, imaging data, data from devices and patient registries, device generated data, patient generated health data, medical records, medical billing claims, just to name a few. And there is flexibility in the use of our real world evidence regulation. However, it's got to be valid scientific evidence. It must demonstrate a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness to justify marketing. Our regulation considers many different types of studies and data as supportive. But you can see in the diagram here, the National Evaluation System of Health Technologies, otherwise known as NEST, was developed to link all shareholders, stakeholders, in ensuring device safety and effectiveness. And an important objective of this program was to create the CRNs that Molly was mentioning, or coordinated registry networks. CRNs can close a lot of data gaps through linkages of registry, taking advantage of the strengths of each individual registry and linking them to larger databases, both administrative and otherwise. And this is done through sophisticated data mining using artificial intelligence and deep machine learning. To use this technology, we need to ensure, however, as Molly pointed out, relevant and similar definitions of terms, coding of diagnosis between large databases. And this really can be a daunting task. So I'm glad Molly's on there. In 2017, we published a guidance document, and you can see the link below, on the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices. The document describes two key pillars of importance in evaluating real-world evidence: relevance and reliability. With respect to relevance, it's important to have evidence of clinical experience in sufficient detail to capture the device use the exposures and the outcomes of interest in the appropriate population of patients. And with respect to reliability, how is the data being collected and who's collecting the data? What are the data elements and what are the definitions? How is the information aggregated from the different data sources? What is the quality of the data? And what are the standards to ensure data analysis are reliable and trustworthy? Do we really have standards for use of real world evidence yet? Or are they in development? And so we're looking to the QC, and we know that the QC has taken a number of steps to position themselves to address these issues and to yield appropriate real world evidence. So for the surgeon, registries can answer, I think, really important clinical questions such as how much mesh is too much mesh? Can I use mesh in a contaminated surgical field? When should I use mesh to prevent a hernia? Do all hernias need to be repaired with mesh? Do all hernias need to be repaired? When is staged repair the more appropriate choice in a particular patient? These are clinical questions, and FDA does not interfere with practice of medicine until the changes in the mesh technology or indications are made in response to clinical needs. And so we look at clinical data collected in registries and other sources of real-world evidence, including off-label device use, and we'll consider that data in making our regulatory decisions for new or expanded indications for use. Participation in registry allows the surgeon to know their surgical outcomes compared to other surgeons in a de-identified manner, allows them to use registry resources to improve their outcomes and help other surgeons improve theirs. You know, and the truth is, hernia repair complications are related not only to the mesh device, but also to surgical technique and patient characteristics. And so the granular data, we feel, found in the QC registry and in future global hernia mesh CRNs will help distinguish the cause of hernia repair complications, provide a means through communication, training, and research to take corrective action. So the QC provides data on a shelf, as to quote Mike Rosen, or readily accessible clinical data on mesh devices, and can help surgeons decide whether or not to change their choice of mesh in hernia repair. The QC has over 40 relevant publications based on QC data that have appeared in peer-reviewed journals to include comparison of outcomes after partial and complete mesh excision, telescopic dissection versus balloon dissection for total laparoscopic total extraperitoneal inguinal hernia repair. This was actually a randomized controlled trial that was embedded in the registry. And such publications not only inform surgeons, but can be used to support FDA regulatory decisions. So, and you know, I'm proud to say this, the QC, I believe, is the first registry to recognize the importance of the patient's perspective. In addition to the educational patient portal and the recently published iPhone Oracle app for patient education and preparation and recovery from surgery, the QC has an active patient engagement component with representation in the executive committee. Here, patients can share their experiences regarding hernia surgery and surgical mesh with surgeons, industry, and FDA representatives. So, in a recent article published from the Danish National Patient Registry that was reported in JAMA, they reviewed their patient registry for long-term complications, but they did so only in patients that were hospitalized and required additional surgery. The authors concluded that the rate of long-term complications from mesh was a scary 5% for 5 years, but they also appropriately realized that this number might actually be larger because patients with recurrent hernias and chronic mesh infections, chronic pain are not always hospitalized. And so how do we achieve a more accurate picture of long-term hernia surgery and mesh outcomes? Well, you know, when I was a medical student going back several years, you know, I was told the importance of history and physical exam before labs and CT scan, including getting the patient's perspective from the get-go. And I remember an attending asked me, if you ask the patient, they'll tell you what's wrong. And drawing from this principle, simple questions developed by Ben Polos and other investigators in the QC were found to accurately determine if a patient had a hernia recurrence. Do you see or feel a bulge at the surgical site? Do you think your hernia has come back? Do you have pain or physical symptoms at the hernia site? These questions were subsequently called the hernia recurrence inventory and really were found to rival physical examination, dynamic abdominal ultrasound in detecting recurrent hernias with a sensitivity of 84 to 94%, 94% specific, better than imaging in some cases. So perhaps there are other simple questions, as Savannah pointed out, with the hernia Q that can be asked of patients that might indicate other mesh complications. We're excited about this. And we think this may be really key to improving long-term follow-up in registries, because patients really don't want to come back to their surgeons if they don't need to, and insurance companies aren't going to pay for additional clinic visits. This is a nice way to screen patients for their complications. This is what we have currently. This is our MDR reporting system. This is a passive system. It's limited because frequently it's incomplete and duplicated. The reports are submitted by multiple reporters, and they can be incomprehensible in some cases. The reporters are varying expertise. And the problem is we don't know what the denominator is. We don't know the actual mesh use in the marketplace. So we don't have a denominator to really know what the incidence of these adverse events are. And if you look at the spreadsheet there, you have to click on every one of those little blanks there, or those little spaces, to get the narrative on the mesh, which, like I said, is frequently 2 or 3 sentences. It doesn't give you a whole lot. And there was one occasion where I went down through 15 of those. I thought I was clicking on the same space, but there were 15 different reports on the same complication with just minimally different narratives. And so it is very difficult. And that's why, the FDA over the last 10 years has dedicated efforts on a more active method of evaluating the device performance post-market, and that to really understand the total product life cycle. The Medical Product Safety Network, or MedSun, has over 300 hospitals where we have two-way communication to help understand and solve problems related to mesh and other devices. If we see a problem, we can institute what we call the 522, which is a post-market study. But really, real-world evidence and registries best fulfills FDA's need to understand device performance throughout its life cycle, and has really become and is one of FDA's strategic priorities. And so we realized in this, and stated in this publication, that active post-market surveillance needs to be a collaborative effort. We really can't do it alone. And so, all stakeholders really have a responsibility. It's not just the surgeon, it's not just industry, it's not just FDA. All stakeholders have a responsibility to review data available on mesh devices before implanting them in patients, we feel. And we're really confident that robust mesh registries, linked global registries with meaningful common data elements and a means for long-term follow-up will provide this data as they continue to evolve. And, FDA really looks forward to continuing to support the efforts of the QC. We think it's a real fantastic effort. And so thank you for that. Happy to entertain any questions. And I put there the link to our MedWatch for any, for reporting of medical device issues. But please, if you can, put as much detail as you can. It really is helpful. I also included in one of the slides the link to the guidance document on our use of real-world evidence. Happy to entertain any questions.
Another excellent talk. I have a question. Certainly mesh is not the only implant in the realm of medicine. For instance, orthopedic colleagues, they are certainly putting in a lot of implants as well. Is there anything we can learn from other fields? Is there anything the QC can learn, or us as surgeons, as far as monitoring some of these long-term complications?
Well, I always think back on the metal and metal hip implants. mesh complications can occur 10 years out. I think Ben has an excellent slide on a mesh infection that occurred 10 years later. I don't know if there's a time regarding when we can stop following up meshes long-term, because I don't think that the curve ever really plateaus. Now, with regards to the metal-on-metal hip implants, you know, they did the 2-year study. They did the randomized controlled trial, and it looked really good, especially for young patients compared to the plastic implants. But what came to be, and this was recognized through the European registries, that these metal implants were breaking down and releasing chromium and causing severe inflammatory responses in the joints. And the chromium levels in some of these young patients was quite high. And you know, chromium causes organic brain syndrome. And so the question then is, do you remove the hip implants? Do you remove the mesh if there's completely or not? Big operations, if you use a very large piece of mesh, that can be a very difficult problem. So I don't know if that answered your question, Clayton, but I just feel like the long-term follow-up piece has got to be part of any review of the total product life cycle of some of these devices. And that goes for the orthopedic devices as well, and the cardiac implantable devices.
This is Benita, if I can add, you know, I think that the QC has proven themselves at this point to be an entity that many other registries can learn from. You know, within a very short period of time, you've elevated to the status that George has described. And I think your continuous process improvements, you know, looking through the data, what can we do better, where there's an opportunity, who can we collaborate with, has really elevated this registry to a level where I think it's one where other groups can look to and learn from. I think many years ago, not many years ago, because you're only about 8 years ago, but the first couple of years, you know, we would direct Mike and Ben, you know, talk to these registry folks, talk to those folks. I think at this point, you all are doing a fantastic job. I mean, the fact that you can autonomously function in the example that George provided based just on 27 adverse events and have industry take action is impressive. And that's really where professional societies and surgeons really need to be. They need to be playing out in the front and addressing these questions and causing manufacturers and others to take action. And we're, as a federal agency, we're a little bit removed. So relying on FDA to do that sort of thing, it's going to be a little bit delayed. I mean, unfortunately, I think the QC has just done an amazing job. And I think you're at a position where people can be learning from you at this point.
Well, certainly Mike and Ben were pretty thoughtful in putting this group of 4 lectures together. And I think that there's definitely a theme and they all kind of fit together very nicely. Mike, did you want to make any last comments?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to, moderators, great job. I barely said anything. I try not to ever speak during this, so phenomenal job. And I obviously all the speakers, particularly, you know, Benita and George, you guys were there in the beginning. You guided us through many of our difficult decisions. But I would say, you know, to me, one of the things that tonight and honestly last month's QC with the patient engagement is, you know, this is kind of all that work coming to fruition and building the foundation, because what this is really about is what happened tonight, where kind of all the different stakeholders get in a room, get on a call, get on a Zoom meeting and talk to each other and listen to each other and kind of understand where we're going. And honestly, you know, I look at my job as a QC as kind of always trying to think, what is the next thing? What do we need to do? How do we need to get better? You know, what are we missing? What is the avenue that we go in? And I think kind of hearing this alignment of, you know, where we need to go is exciting for us. And I think that, you know, I look at this as a continuous growth process. And like we said, quality improvement. And I think all the people on this call are, you know, need to be heavily credited, and all the different stakeholders, because this, you know, this takes a lot of people to make this work. So I just want to say thanks to everybody. This was a phenomenal conversation. I think, the message is clear to us, and it's our job to execute that. And we need your support and help to figure out how to execute that, but we will continue to do it. So thanks a lot. Everybody have a great night. Thanks for getting on, and we'll see you next month. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.